Hi, everyone. It's 4 o'clock in New York. The Marie Antoinette presidency of Donald J. Trump has a decidedly grifty edge to it today. As economic pain multiplies from Donald Trump's war of choice in Iran, there are signs that suggest a select group of insiders are cashing in. Democrats on Capitol Hill today are sounding the alarm after Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent floated the idea of economic support for the UAE, citing the country's close financial ties to the Trump family. New York Times reports that, quote, it is not clear how big a lifeline the Emirates might need or even whether it needs one at all. What is clear, however, is the financial relationship between the UAE and the Trump family. Earlier this year, the brother of the UAE's president bought a 49% stake in the Trump family crypto company, World Liberty Financial. It's a company which one Trump supporter and investor said was a, quote, golden opportunity to leverage the Trump brand to profit through fraud. Said that in a lawsuit he filed against the company. Donald Trump's sons have cleaned up during the war with Iran, with Donald Jr. personally benefiting from making investments in prediction markets, investments which have gone up tenfold in value since the start of Trump's second term as president. The AP reports this, quote, one of the biggest fee generators lately has been Trump's approach to the Iran war. Notably, his Truth Social post on April 5th, demanding the country, quote, open the effing straight. Trading on Polymarket soared with yes or no wagers on whether an invasion was imminent. That's according to one analysis firm, only to be surpassed on April 7th by betting on another question. Will there be a ceasefire? When Trump posted ominously that a, quote, whole civilization will die tonight. The Trump administration has sued states that are trying to ban prediction markets. And of course, there's the whole category that is the other son, Eric Trump. He recently went on Fox News to champion a $24 million Pentagon contract that his robotics company won.
I couldn't believe what I saw. Coming from hospitality, the uses are unlimited. When you go up and you interact with these robots and they fist bump you, they high five you, they follow your commands, you bring in AI autonomy, it's going to change industry, it's going to change military application, it's going to change hospitality.
The interview where Eric Trump talks about how robots can fist bump will be with me forever. Well, the Trumps are making out like bandits, with the Trump family's net worth up by nearly $3 billion since the second term began 15 months ago. The economic anxiety and the economic pain, the cost for everyone else in America is soaring, including for a whole bunch of Donald Trump's own voters and supporters who put him back in the White House largely because he promised them he would lower the cost of everything. Remember? The groceries, everything. Now, the International Monetary Fund says that the war in Iran could trigger a global recession. And the executive director of the International Energy Agency says that we are facing the biggest energy security threat in history. Grift for me, rising gas prices for thee, as Donald Trump's approach to running the White House is where we start today. Political analyst, former Senator Claire McCaskill joins us. Also joining us, Scott MacFarlane. He is now the chief Washington correspondent and host of Scott MacFarlane Reports for the Midas Touch, which I get in my email and I watch every day. You are absolutely killing it, my friend. And with me at the table for the hour, former Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs during the Obama administration, MS Now political analyst Rick Stengel. Claire, I know that everything has been shuffled in the time of Trump, but there are a couple things that voters have always absolutely loathed, absolutely hated, and it is stealing and grifting and self-enrichment, corruption. Trump is doing it in full view, and so are his kids. What is the political, why haven't the laws of political gravity caught up with them?
Well, the corruption has been swallowed whole by the chaos. And Trump kind of knows that. I mean, he is chaotic on purpose. I mean, even within one sentence, he is chaotic, much less the way he's trying to run the country. So, it is, but it's fascinating to me because the Democrats are rightfully focused on cost, but it really is the three C's: is cost and chaos and corruption. And the corruption is by far the most serious this country has ever seen. I mean, think back to the time that the Republicans were losing their you-know-what over Biden's son being on a board and selling some paintings. And look at what these sons are doing. It is outrageous that Eric Trump is getting contracts with the Pentagon. And somebody needs to be doing an investigation, if not now, then hopefully after we win in November, as to whether or not that was a competitive bid. I bet you a buck it wasn't.
And what about, I mean, Claire, what is sort of all the atrophied muscles in Congress certainly reveal themselves when Trump and his allies are enriching themselves on matters of war, where 13 U.S. service members have died, have lost their lives, 13 American families buried, sons and daughters, and a bunch of Trump cronies got rich on betting on which way the war would go?
Well, first of all, this has got to stop. I mean, betting on war is really not an American value. Making money off predicting what government does without any kind of regulation. I mean, we're worried about members of Congress trading stock. Give me a break. They've got to file really detailed financial disclosures every year. Isn't anybody worried about who's betting on these unregulated markets? Members of Congress and everybody in the Trump administration can make a boatload of money betting on these markets with insider information. And there's nobody policing it. It's frankly beyond outrageous. And there's so much work to be done if the Democrats do take majorities in the House and or the Senate in terms of investigations. But at the top of the list, it needs to be this corruption, because people need to make a stand that this is not going to be accepted in the future. This is not who we are as a country. This is not what the founding fathers envisioned, the way they set up our Constitution.
Yeah, I mean, Scott, I'm not sure how much of this even needs a roll-up-your-sleeves, old-school SDNY-style forensic accounting investigation. So much of it is happening in full view. Here's how Senator Jon Ossoff describes it.
Well, let's call it what it would be, which is a bailout for the United Arab Emirates. The financial entanglement, the way that UAE money, Emirati money from Emirati royals has compromised this White House is astonishing. It may be one of the most significant scandals in American history. Who are the president's two chief negotiators in the Middle East? Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff. Witkoff and his family are partners. His son, Zach Witkoff, is the key partner in the Trump family crypto business, which has received vast sums of money from Emirati royalty. The spy chief, the national security advisor in the United Arab Emirates, acquired a 49% stake in that business before the United States agreed to grant the UAE access to our most sensitive AI chips. Then you have Jared Kushner, his private equity firm, Affinity Partners, which in addition to receiving billions of dollars from Saudi Arabia, has received a lot of Emirati money. The people doing our diplomacy are at the same time doing personal business across the region that's enriching the first family. And meanwhile, my constituents in Georgia are paying $4 for gas, paying more for groceries, rent, power, and a meal out at a restaurant than ever before in American history.
I take Claire's point that the chaos and velocity of scandal make it difficult to focus in on one thing. But there is one thing that is never shielded from our eyes, and that's the fact that Jared Kushner, who is, by his own description of himself, a businessman, a man who didn't hide his pursuit of Middle East millions and millions. He got more than Steve Mnuchin got at the end of the first term after not having really the same kind of record as an investor. He has made no secret of all of the millions and millions in Middle East money he has under his direction. And he is the public face of American diplomacy at the time of war.
I appreciate that Senator McCaskill is willing to wager $1. I will bet the whole farm Democrats launch an investigation into Eric Trump's contract, Jared Kushner's business dealings, if and when they get the majority back in January. You can make book on that right now. But I can't get past the domestic politics of all this. Money for the UAE because of the war in Iran. Money for the Trump family or a contract for the Trump family, while clearly prices are the defining issue with roughly 150 days, Nicole, till early voting starts. And I saw a number that was shared with me earlier today. $250 million has been reserved by the House Majority PAC there to elect more Democrats in November. Listen to the states they're putting money in now. Tennessee, South Carolina, and Alaska. So U.S. House races. And this is like picking these economic issues for the Trump administration is like picking up a bunch of kryptonite and juggling it if you're Superman. You are begging for trouble.
Okay. I'm going to read you something that Donald Trump posted online. I want you to decide whether or not you personally believe it. And here it is, quote, I'm going to do my best with his voice. For those people, fewer in number now than ever before, that think that I am anxious to end the war, if you would even call it that, with Iran, please be advised that I am possibly the least pressured person ever to be in this position. I have all the time in the world, but Iran doesn't. I am not anxious. I am not pressured. Kind of sounds like you are, doesn't it? Now, setting aside all of the reports outlining how Trump is searching for a way out of his war of choice, of course, and the very real fact that Iran does indeed benefit from a drawn-out conflict, there's a lot of evidence that all the time in the world is not necessarily making things better on this side of the conflict. Just today, the head of the International Energy Agency warned that the world is facing its biggest energy security threat in history. Gas prices remain incredibly high thanks to the continued blockade of the Strait of Hormuz. Yesterday, the Washington Post reported that the Pentagon told Congress it could take 6 months to fully clear the Strait of mines deployed by Iran. And it appears that story might have crossed Trump's desk because today he ordered the Navy to shoot and kill Iranian boats that are laying such mines. But the clock is ticking, and the longer this conflict goes on, the bigger the consequences get, which is why it was interesting that Trump made this particular comparison when asked about his war timeline.
On the war with Iran, how long are you willing to wait until you get a unified response?
Don't rush me, Jeff. Guys like you want to say, oh, so we were in Vietnam like for 18 years. We were in Iraq for many, many years. We're in for I don't like to say World War II because that was a biggie, but we were 4.5, almost 5 years in World War II. We were in the Korean War for 7 years. I've been doing this for 6 weeks, and the military is totally defeated.
Joining me now is retired Rear Admiral John Kirby. He's the former Pentagon press secretary and White House National Security Communications Advisor. He's also the spokesperson at the State Department. He's basically had every single job in national security. Let me start by asking you this. It's great to see you, of course. I mean, referencing the Vietnam War, given his own history of claiming bone spurs, was quite a choice on Trump's part. But the intention seemed to be to set the expectation that this could go on for a while, right? That though he said 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 6 weeks, he may need much more time. I just wonder the impact of that. One, on the men and women serving, people who are stationed in the Middle East who don't know where this is going, but also really on the outcome of this war and the impacts of it on the country.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, when I heard those comments, I had the same phrase, set the expectations. That's exactly what he's doing. He's preparing the American people. And you're right, he's preparing troops and their families for a longer fight than what they had previously anticipated, or at least what he had previously anticipated for. But you know what, Jen? He's also setting the expectations for the negotiating table. I mean, he extended the ceasefire because he really wants to try to find a diplomatic way out of this and say what he wants. I mean, it's clear he wants to find an exit ramp. So you extend the ceasefire in the hopes that the Iranians will come to the table. And you say things like, I'm not in a big hurry, to convey to the Iranians, like, hey, I can wait you out. You know, now's your chance. You got to come to the table. The other audience that he's talking to, in my view, is the Israelis, who don't want to see this war end prematurely and end in a way that leaves the regime in power of nuclear material and or preponderance of their missiles and their drones. And so I think he's also communicating to the Israelis, like, I'm not rushing to the exit here. But he looks at the polls. He sees the gas prices. I think it's clear that he wants to find a way out of here as quickly as possible.
The New York Times published this new reporting on the state of Iranian leadership. A really fascinating story. And as you and I both know, I mean, it's always been fractious. It's always been divided kind of in Iran between the religious leaders, the military. I mean, there's always been a little bit of fractions. But the Times... A source told the Times that the current Ayatollah might be leader in name, but he's not supreme the way his father was. They said he's subservient to the Islamic Revolutionary Guards because he owes his position and he owes the survival of the system to them. And I thought this was important because as we're looking at negotiations and what we're hearing from the Iranians and what I think everybody out there is hoping this comes to an end, I wonder how big a deal that is, given it seems kind of even more fractured than it was 10 years ago.
It's a huge deal. You remember well during the Obama administration, as we were negotiating the Iran deal, how important it is when you're sitting across the table that your interlocutor on the other side has the authority, has the accountability, and is speaking for the government. In the case of the Iran deal that President Obama and John Kerry negotiated, the supreme leader at the time, Khamenei, made it clear to everybody in what was, you're right, a fractured government that this mattered to him and everybody needed to get on board. And so John Kerry had the ability to negotiate in good faith. That's not happening right now because the government is even more fractured than it was before, and the IRGC is much more in power than they were before, and they're not at the table. It's not them being represented by the Iranian government, and so you saw this once the ceasefire got announced. Just a couple of days after that, the IRGC fired at 2 ships in the Gulf, making it clear that they didn't agree with the ceasefire and that they weren't a party to the negotiations. So it's going to make it very, very tough to come up with an agreement that you can be sure on our side of the table that everybody on the Iranian side is going to get behind and actually enforce.
There's so much to read between the lines here. I'm so grateful you could be here as always, John Kirby. Thank you so much again.
Thank you, Jim.
Okay.
Back in July 2025, when there were some influencers posting videos of how they were literally burning their MAGA hats. It was quite the image you can see here. It was stunning to some who are accustomed to the talk about a president who has such a loyal MAGA base. But this, of course, was just a few people. What was notable was the charred hats. We didn't even know which people they were. Tonight, it's not about burning hats. It's about burning bridges by very important MAGA leaders, the kind with millions of followers, not just the kind with a video camera and a hat. Tucker Carlson has gone beyond criticism to formally split with Trump. You've probably heard about this story if you follow the news, and for good reason. It is a huge deal. It is a break with Trump that it would be very hard to undo, and it speaks to a larger problem in the early lame duck period of this troubled second term. Tucker cast his defection as more than a choice. He basically said it was a moral necessity, a matter of conscience. He's even mused about a sort of religious failing, a possible evil or anti-Christ element working within Donald Trump. Fact check, way above my pay grade, but that's the level of vitriol, of moral judgment against his one-time ally, Donald Trump. Tonight, we can tell you another former Fox host with a similarly large MAGA following, Megyn Kelly, is channeling, frankly, the liberal critique of Trump that you've heard since at least 2015 when he burst on the political scene, that Trump is unfit for office because of his immorality, his character, his temperament. She also adds in the particular pain of former Trump backers who have found, often in public, that there is no loyalty in return with him. No matter how loyally you serve him, even, for example, as his vice president for the whole term, or in the rooms giving him national security advice only to find yourself indicted. It's the familiar refrain of people who did serve him loyally only to run into what Kelly, and I'm going to show you the clip, now calls his demon-like response. Notice how Tucker and Kelly both reached for the occult, the supernatural, the good versus evil frame, which is more than blue versus red, I would remind us. The issue is that Trump went on to try to ruin the lives of his own aides, Kelly, Bolton, Cohen, Vice President Pence. It's a pattern. That's what they found last term. We all witnessed it. And so someone who would do that to people who served him loyally, who he broke bread with, whose families he knew, how would he treat the rest of the unknown MAGA fans or soldiers or citizens paying their higher gas prices. If he doesn't care about them, he certainly doesn't care about you. And apparently Megyn Kelly and her audience are discovering that now.
There are aspects of his personality which are obviously not good and that we've mostly just chosen to overlook. You know, he's not a moral man. He's obviously not the greatest husband in the world. And he's extremely petty and thin-skinned, extremely petty and thin-skinned. You know, there's no loyalty in return ever from Trump, ever. At this particular moment, he's alienating so many of his core supporters. Some of those darker demons are much more in the front view right now.
Demons, petty, amoral, alienating everybody. That's Megyn Kelly. This is a kind of breakdown that is now haunting Trump's second term at probably one of the worst possible times. Certainly since the war has been a tough time for him going into the midterms. This is not a politics story like when you turn on the news and the top story is an election or what political people are saying or a story about a politician. It's not really that. This is a politics responding to reality story. As people see Trump's war boosting the real prices they're paying right now, from gas to groceries, a war with no apparent endgame. Americans overwhelmingly sour on Trump's economy. Remember, that's part of what got him elected, a vow to improve the economy, to lower prices. 56% say he's hurting the economy. A paltry 28% thinks he's helping. Megyn Kelly is joining along with Tucker Carlson, who was even more emphatic than her because he's ditched Trump for good. And he didn't just say, I'm out. He said, I'm out, and I'm sorry I was ever in. He literally apologized for the 2024 backing like it was some kind of moral failing, something to reckon with, his consciousness, if you favor that Tucker-esque discourse. Now, Trump sees these people ditching, and he knows they matter. Podcast titan Joe Rogan has been criticizing Trump on immigration, on deploying soldiers to U.S. cities, and on the war. Now, he didn't give a burning bridge announcement the way Tucker did, and so it was noticeable that this White House tried to warm up the famously independent media star with an invite for a different issue that Rogan also covers. And you can see him there directly behind the president, the issue of the drug war and the possible benefits of psychedelics. Now, Rogan attended, he spoke a bit, but you got to give some credit to Rogan's independence. He got that big access. There are a lot of people in media and politics who would be thrilled on the right to go join the MAGA Republican president in the Oval Office, flanked by other cabinet officials, might mute their criticism at least for a month. So credit to Rogan. That access did not quiet what he says are his genuine concerns about Trump's war. Here he was again today.
How this is ever going to work out, you know, I really don't know. How do you get out of this? And then what does the exit look like? Do we have troops over there forever now? Do we subsidize them if we blow up their power grid and
I don't know.
all their infrastructure? It doesn't make sense they choose to do it when they did it.
Fair questions, plain English, clear critique. And he didn't just mute it for 2 weeks or do some sort of transactional thing. He's just doing what he does with millions of people listening. 70% also say the economy is not only bad, like I showed you, but in a separate polling question, that it is getting worse, which reflects a downcast view of the Trump economy and what people likely perceive as the war problem going into the midterms. People don't expect this to happen overnight, that we would get improvement. Fox News noting the economic gloom, the bad Trump ratings signal tough GOP midterms, and the channel also reporting on what it has referred to at times as the Trump government's incompetence.
New polls show people are not confident that our government is competent, and the president's approval rating stands at 42%. He's way behind on inflation, the economy, and government spending.
And that's just one poll. Trump is even lower in others. A third of Republicans unhappy with his leadership. The MAGA audience that Fox and Tucker and Kelly speak to has clearly found more skepticism of Trump. Democrats have a 6-point advantage in the generic battleground ballot. That's from the nonpartisan Cook Political Report. It matches the situation. There is some time between now and the midterms. But again, there isn't any clear evidence that a lot of this would change overnight. Because as I mentioned, this is not a politics story, by which we mean the ideologies and the brands and the things that people say in exchange about politics. in person and online. This is a reality story. Or as our friend James Carville said, an economy stupid story, but not just politics. The spike in gas prices is a war tax. It's hitting home. And there are reports on the broader problems in the war Trump started where there isn't a good endgame. A fifth of the world's oil is now blocked. That is a worse position than we were in before this war started. The Pentagon today has told Congress that even when this strait is reopened as they hope, it would be a slow rebound. 6 months to clear out the mines that are in there because of the war. Gas prices elevated through the midterms. This war of choice by Trump is also now the biggest energy threat in history, according to the International Energy Agency. And as Americans pay, as if this was all not bad enough in the very measurable ways that it is bad and worse than before Trump got involved, everyone would be happier in America and at the pump if he just didn't do things, if he just wasn't president, or at least president on Iran policy. That's true of even MAGA supporters. But amidst all that, the Trump administration's corruption deepens in public. And I'll just tell you this as someone who's kind of covered a lot of this as a reporter and a lawyer. It could take years of thorough, independent, and I would hope nonpartisan investigations to even get to the bottom of the Trump swamp corruption. The second term, unlike anything we've seen in the modern era, worse than Nixon measurably in the amount of graft. The crypto, the payoffs, the self-dealing, the alleged market and betting manipulation, which must be investigated because we don't know how high it goes. There's clear reports and evidence, for example, of abuse of insider information. We don't know if it goes all the way up to the top of the White House or the upper middle range of cabinet members or lower middle. It's a problem for the U.S. either way. It has to be investigated if we care about it. Remember, bribery is also an enumerated impeachable offense if anyone got involved in bribery that touches on the president. Again, that has to be investigated, not assumed, investigated, but boy, is there a lot of smoke out here. And that brings me to this conflict of interest drawing huge concern today as you, the American people, quite literally pay much higher prices for this open-ended war. Donald Trump's son, Eric, has scored a $24 million contract with the Pentagon for his company.
Foundation Future Industries, a robotic startup, aims to develop these autonomous humanoid robots. The company just secured a $24 million contract with the Pentagon and the company's chief strategy advisor, Eric Trump, President Trump's son. Congratulations to you both.
Coming from hospitality, the uses are unlimited. But, Maria, you're just talking about China. We are America first. We have to win this race.
The sound you hear is of Trump breaking two vows at once. Drain the swamp and end forever wars. Pentagon budget ballooning in requests under this war. The price of the war ballooning that you're paying. The swamp, as you see, is active. Even if it doesn't reach the level of criminality, it is an obvious, illicit, scandalous conflict of interest to be paying off your son through the Pentagon in the same way that Republicans used to worry about much, much, much smaller sums allegedly from a Biden son. And by the way, if any of that much smaller amount of money was only a product of his dad being president, it was also wrong, as we would report here. But however wrong it was as a measurable corruption matter, it has now been dwarfed by this Trump swamp while you pay for it. Donald Trump's family is profiting, quite relatedly, to his unilateral choice to bomb Iran and get more money for the Pentagon while everyone else pays the costs. If you wonder why Tucker Carlson and Megyn Kelly are mad, those are some reasons, plus their audience. If you wonder why their audience is mad, well, that's obvious. And then the question becomes, how mad is everyone going to get going into the voting booth in November?
Let's start the hour with MS Now Washington reporter and co-host of The Weekend, Jackie Alemany at the White House. MS Now senior national security reporter David Rohde is here with me, and two senior fellows at the Council of Foreign Relations are joining us, foreign policy columnist Stephen Cook and Washington Post columnist Max Boot. Jackie, you spoke with the president just this morning. What did you learn?
Yeah, Anna, essentially what we got from President Trump was a status on the second round of negotiations that were postponed earlier this week. His answer to that question, essentially TBD, about when J.D. Vance, Steve Witkoff, and Jared Kushner will return to Islamabad to continue to try to hash out a longer-term deal. He told me, and I'll read the quote, that Iran has no idea who their leader is at this moment. He said they're all messed up. You know, we took out really 3 levels of leaders and everybody that was even close behind him, so they have a hard time figuring out who the hell can speak for their country. They just don't know. Now, I'm going to save the fact check for our colleague David Rohde, who quickly spoke with a bunch of experts about Trump's claims, who have essentially said that they're incorrect. And I think some important context here that, might help illuminate why the sudden posture change and different tone change that we're hearing from the White House about extending patience to Iran, issuing an indefinite ceasefire, and basically allowing them to take their time and coming back to the negotiating table is the intense political pressure that he is under right now. He has new polling out this morning that shows that his approval ratings are at an all-time low. You have energy experts around the world saying that the world is really now facing the greatest security threat in modern history with regards to the lack of oil that is coming through the Strait of Hormuz. But meanwhile, the U.S. has said that they're going to continue this blockade. The Iranians have said that they would be more likely to return to the negotiating table if that blockade is ended by the U.S. military. So a lot of moving parts here, everything changing really hour by hour.
Jackie Alemany, keep us posted. Thank you for that reporting. David, what are your sources telling you about the comments we heard from the president this morning and those really interesting videos we're seeing both sides release?
I just want to thank Jackie for getting that interview. She's done an incredible job of reporting at the White House. In terms of those videos, again, the president talks about the Iranian Navy's been decimated. Every boat has been sunk. Well, there are members of the Iranian Navy, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, seizing a tanker. You can see it yourself on their videos, and they seized 3 tankers yesterday. They have a navy. They have closed the Strait of Hormuz, period. So the president's claim there is false. And then the president's claim that the problem is the Iranians and they don't know who their leader is and they're all divided. That is also false. I mean, I've talked to multiple experts, and there's an amazing story in the New York Times. Farnaz Fasihi wrote it for them. She spoke to 23 people inside Iran. And so what has happened is the supreme leader was killed. His son has been named as a new leader. But essentially a group of Iranian Revolutionary Guard generals have taken over. They are in firm control of the country. They were already in power. It's not a new regime. And in a way, it's more hardline. But these generals are controlling Iran. They are deciding who negotiates where. So it's not a new government. It's not a divided government. And if anything, it's more hardline. And that's what I've heard from experts and what the New York Times is reporting as well.
And Stephen, it seems like the U.S. is still trying to figure out the best way to deal with Iran's control over the Strait of Hormuz. Just this morning, President Trump reiterated his threat that the U.S. will strike these small, fast attack boats Iran is using to seize much larger cargo ships and possibly lay more underwater mines. The president has previously said that he did not consider them much of a threat. Did the U.S. underestimate Iran's ability to use what look like recreational speedboats to cripple the strait?
Yeah, this is a tactic that the Iranians have used before. So I think the president's threats this morning are part of a pattern. The pattern where the president threatens escalation, expecting the Iranians to moderate their behavior or to stand down. And the Iranians take him up on the escalation, and then he's confronted with whether he has to escalate or look for some other solution to the problem. I think what's interesting about this episode, particularly with the extension of the ceasefire that the president announced yesterday, is that it's clear that the Iranians have figured him out. They have called his bluff. He does not want to escalate. And now they are playing this game where they say, we will go to the negotiating table, but you have to lift the blockade. That would be a tremendous humiliation and setback for the president if he were forced to do that.
Max, you have a plan for how to move negotiations ahead, and it starts with the U.S. paring down the agenda. Walk us through it.
Well, my thought is that, it's possible that Trump could actually achieve something with his blockade if he doesn't get too ambitious. He's not going to convince the Iranians to suddenly surrender and give in to all his demands. They made pretty clear That's not going to happen. But I think there is the possibility of using the U.S. blockade of Iranian shipping as a bargaining chip to force the Iranians to lift their blockade of all non-Iranian shipping. So essentially what I think we should do now is offer an open for open deal to the Iranians where we lift our blockade and they lift their blockade. And that essentially removes the gun from the head of the global economy and also from the head of the Iranian economy, because both are in serious jeopardy as long as the blockades continue, and buy some time to have lengthy negotiations on the nuclear issue, which are not going to be resolved overnight. I think that's the only way forward, because otherwise, if both blockades stay in place, it's basically a ticking time bomb, and the damage to the global economy will worsen. We're likely to be thrust into a recession. The damage to the Iranian economy will worsen as well. But again, I very much doubt that this cabal of generals, who, as David noted, are now in charge of Iran, I very much doubt that they will surrender on what they see as their red lines.
And David, on the economic pressure, it looks like it's a test of wills in many ways. On one hand, the president is risking costing his party the midterms at this point because of the cost of gas prices. On the other hand, Iran is really putting so much trade at risk here, $500 million a day in lost trade because of the blockade the U.S. has inflicted them with. Which side can endure more pain longer?
So Sudeep Reddy, MS Now's Washington bureau chief, asked me and Julia Jester, who covers the State Department, to ask experts. And the vast majority said Iran clearly can endure more economic pain. It's a terrible situation. This is a terrible government. It's, shot and killed protesters. But because Iran isn't a democracy, they're not really accountable to the population. And beyond that, they have been under some kind of sanctions since like the 1980s. So it will hurt them. They're going to be short on cash. They can't sell oil, but they grow their own food. They've learned how to limit, the kind of imports they need. Whereas oil experts are saying if this continues through the end of April, some of the gas shortages, not just high prices, but a shortage of fuels that we see in Asia and other parts of the world, could start hitting the U.S. next month.
And so, Stephen, Jackie told us, there are these logistical and communication challenges that the president discussed with her that he's dealing with and why it's halted negotiations moving forward. I want to play just a portion of what he's been saying about finding an end to the war. Let's listen.
The entire country can be taken out in one night, and that night might be tomorrow night. Let's see what happens. Maybe they make a deal, maybe they don't. From the standpoint of America, we win. I think they will agree to it. I'm almost sure of it. In fact, I am sure of it. If they don't agree, there's no deal. There'll never be a deal. Iran will not have a nuclear weapon. We can do whatever we want. And it should be ending pretty soon.
That sense of urgency, what do all the posts the president's been putting out signal to Iran? And does it help the U.S. negotiating position?
Well, I'm not sure it's a sense of urgency. I get the sense of desperation of a president who backed himself into a conflict that he thought would be over in a number of days. And I think the Iranians have a pretty good read on the president and are not taking him up on any of the bluster. They are responding in kind. So I think it would suggest that negotiations, if they happen, it will be long and extremely difficult. But they know these are the hardest of the hardliners in Iran. They are willing to allow the Iranians to eat dirt before capitulating to the United States. That's not likely to be the case if and when there are gas shortages in the United States or people's summer travel seasons are disrupted because there's lack of jet fuel. I think the president knows this, and he's looking for different ways by threatening escalation, and that's his only card, and the Iranians have just not been willing to play.
And Max, both CBS and NBC News are now reporting that Iran's missile capabilities have not been destroyed as significantly as the president and the Pentagon have been saying. How concerning is this? How has Iran been able to be so resilient militarily?
I think this is another example of a nation that's pretty successfully waging asymmetric warfare against the United States, even though we're much more powerful. We've seen, another version of this in previous decades in Iraq and Afghanistan, where, I think the Bush administration and Don Rumsfeld and others were saying, like, how can we possibly not be winning in Iraq because we're so much more powerful than the insurgents? Well, the insurgents in Iraq figured out how to hit America's weak points with IEDs and guerrilla attacks, and the Iranians have figured out how to hit our weak points. and really the weak points of the entire Persian Gulf energy infrastructure, which they've targeted so successfully with missiles and drones. And despite all of the strikes that Pete Hegseth keeps bragging about that we've launched against Iran and the 15,000 targets that we've hit, et cetera, at the end of the day, U.S. intelligence admits that Iran still has significant military capabilities, including perhaps half of their missiles, half of their drones, perhaps half of their speedboats. And it doesn't take much to shut down the Strait of Hormuz. It just takes the threat of an attack on a single tanker or cargo ship to paralyze 20% of the world's global energy flows. And that's the weapon of mass economic destruction that the Iranians are now wielding so successfully. And Trump really has not figured out a counter to that.
All right, let's turn back to the news. Let's bring in investigative reporter for the New York Times, Michael Schmidt. He has some extraordinary new reporting that the FBI investigated a New York Times journalist last month who had reported back in February that FBI Director Kash Patel used bureau personnel for his girlfriend, Alexis Wilkins, providing her with government security and transportation, use of the plane, at taxpayer expense. That's including for personal outings. So, Michael, walk us through what you found here. This is one of the fears of this administration's retribution campaign, that it would go after not just political opponents, but journalists that they believe had made them look bad. What did you find?
Yeah, so reporters sometimes can find themselves caught up in leak investigations where the government wants to figure out who their sources are. And the government will go in and subpoena the reporter. In a pretty extraordinary case earlier this year, the government went in and executed a search warrant at a reporter's home to try and figure out who their sources were. In this instance, the FBI looked at whether a reporter for the New York Times, in simply doing what is widely considered routine reporting, question asking, protected by the First Amendment, whether that action was stalking, and whether that there was stalking that was going on towards the director's girlfriend. We learned that in the days after the Times wrote this story in late February, the FBI interviewed Kash Patel's girlfriend. The FBI went and queried its databases to see what information it had on the New York Times reporter Elizabeth Williamson. And then FBI agents determined that they believed there was enough there to move forward with what's called a preliminary investigation, an investigation into whether the New York Times reporter had broken federal stalking laws, whether they, simply through the reporting on the story. And there was nothing that the Times reporter that had done that went beyond what we do every day as journalists out there, reaching out to people who often we don't know, but are trying to get information from, in a story that's trying to understand how Kash Patel was using the FBI, as whether he was using it for personal reasons that went beyond how different department heads and agency heads and leaders in the government use it. And, the FBI has denied the story. They said it was false. They said that the questions that had come up about Elizabeth Williamson were in connection with a threat that had been made against the director's girlfriend by someone out of Boston in a case that did end up with an arrest. But when we, after that pushback, we had actually gone back and done more reporting to learn about really how specifically this was focused on my colleague Elizabeth Williamson, and how the investigative work was looking at criminal questions on what's, as I was saying before, but it's important to understand, widely accepted normal journalism, journalism that we had thought in the media was protected by the First Amendment.
So, Michael, to explain this a little bit, first of all, the original piece was not disputed by the FBI that Kash Patel's girlfriend was received a full-time SWAT protective detail and had used government taxpayer-funded transportation, that Kash Patel had used the same to go see her at certain events. What they're disputing is, I guess, that Miss Wilkins, his girlfriend, said she felt harassed during the investigative process, the investigative journalism process. And so that the FBI was just looking into those claims that she was being harassed, but that the Department of Justice never pursued that as a case. Does that sound right?
Sort of. I'm not sure the statement was quite that clear, but they were trying to push back on it and trying to make it look like it had been part of something that was different. Even with the FBI as it currently is, and the sort of different relationship that they've had with the truth, we did go back and do more work after they initially pushed back, and we were able to sort of understand better just how much the FBI was focused on this New York Times reporter. The FBI was able to, the FBI has a lot of information in its own files that it's accumulated over the years, and look through those files to see what they had about this New York Times reporter. The FBI agents on the case believed that there was enough evidence to move forward with investigating 2 different laws that they thought had been broken in connection with what they thought was this stalking. Justice Department officials learned about what the FBI was doing and thought it was really outside the norm. They thought that the Justice Department officials thought that it was retaliatory, and they did not think that there was a legal basis to move forward. But the FBI itself, did think that there was enough to continue to investigate and to look at this reporter. And the issue that obviously there's a lot of issues with that. But when Kash Patel has had several things come out about how he has used the FBI as sort of a for personal reasons, and this raised those similar questions.
Yeah. All right. The new piece, very important, investigative reporting by Michael Schmidt. It's in the New York Times right now. Make sure you give it a read. David French, I want to get to David Rohde after this, but when I see such sheer transparent stupidity and such bumbling abuse of power, I really just want to go up to Capitol Hill and talk to Republicans and say, don't you understand what I've been telling you for a year and a half? That if you have Republicans abusing power like this against their political enemies, against reporters they don't like, maybe it's at the New York Times now, maybe it'll be at Fox News or Newsmax in a left-wing Democratic administration. Or if you're concerned about a Republican president saying openly to the Attorney General, arrest my political enemies, then why won't a left-wing president look at that abuse of power and that bumbling and say, I'm going to do the same thing? If you have Brendan Carr, who, by the way, he's going to be a guest for Paramount at the White House Correspondents' Dinner. Imagine. Lucky draw there, I guess. Maybe they just did it by lottery. But if you have Brendan Carr saying, I'm going to stifle the voices of comedians that upset this Republican administration, do they not think a left-wing progressive or some egomaniac billionaire tech monopolist that somehow gets into the White House isn't going to use the same methods? Except they'll be a lot smarter. It'll be a lot more dangerous. Like, how many times does this have to play out for them to understand that their silence actually ends up not only damaging democracy, but it ends up hurting the Republican Party in the long term? There is no doubt about this. I've been in Washington and around Washington long enough. Democrats will see turnabout as fair play. I just wonder, when are they going to wake up and start criticizing this in a way that puts pressure on the administration to stop this nonsense?
Well, I mean, I think the answer is really easy. They're not going to wake up until the Republican primary voter wakes up. Let's just be honest here. All of these members in Congress, they know the primary threat to their career, if they're Republican, is still defying Donald Trump. And so they're not going to wake up until the Republican Party primary voter wakes up. At the end of the day, this is ultimately on the Republican Party primary voter. And, what we're seeing here is, Joe, it's just an enormous amount of pride and hubris If you go back to November of 2024, there was this sense, and going from November to December and then into 2025, that they had destroyed the left, that there was this permanent vibe shift, that everything was changing, that the normal pendulum of American politics had just swung away from the left permanently. And so the amount of arrogance that we saw, the amount of brazen corruption, as if there will never be any accountability, as if there will never be a change in control, as you say, is just extraordinary. And honestly, I do not think it has sunk in to the MAGA part of the Republican Party. It is in such a bubble. I do not think it has sunk in the extent of their political peril right now. And so they're continuing to operate in all of this pride and hubris with no foundation for it in American public opinion. And I expect you're going to see some pretty severe Democratic accountability coming soon. And Republicans will, when it comes, Republicans will wonder where it came from. Well, it came from their own pride and arrogance.
David Rowe, this is an extraordinarily troubling development. It comes on the heels of a Washington Post reporter having her home-rated devices seized as part of an investigation there. We now have, as Michael Schmidt just outlined for us, a New York Times reporter being investigated. I mean, this is exactly what so many people were worried about. When the President Trump was reelected and promised retribution, and we know he has made attacks on the media a centerpiece of his political career. And now he is, in a way he didn't in the first term, he and his team seem to be targeting journalists in a new way, a way that, frankly, let's just call it as un-American.
It's a strategy. It's about, and it just reminds me of, and I wrote a book about this several years ago, but just this concentration of power, the abuse of the FBI and Hoover. Hoover created a list of 12,000 Americans. Some of them were writers and journalists. Some of them were actors. Some of them were, university professors who were deemed as subversive and a threat to the country. And the extraordinary powers of the FBI. And there were all these checks set up after the Hoover scandals and then also after the Nixon scandals and Watergate. All of that is being wiped away by this administration. So, and one of the groups Hoover went after was the John Birch Society. It's not just liberals that and so when you have this secrecy, this concentration of power, this hubris, and a lot, it's in the president himself, abuses happen. So yes, we're targets, but I think many other Americans. This is unchecked, and it's really alarming.
And as Michael Schmidt reports, Elizabeth Wilkins, that New York Times reporter, was interviewed by the FBI. They searched federal databases on her and investigated whether she violated stalking laws, ultimately deciding that she had not. But the message was clearly sent.